Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Apologize for interrupting your conversations. Normally, thanks to Marilyn, I would be calling this meeting to order with chimes, but the chimes are in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, and I have already apologized to Marilyn for that, and I apologize to you for interrupting your conversations in this way. However, all is not lost. Jan Paflis has remembered that she has the invocation, and so she'll be giving it shortly. Al Zacher has remembered that he's giving the paper, and he is here with guests, and he will be giving his paper shortly, so we will proceed even without the chimes. Jan?
Well, my experience tells me that when you face a tough decision, the right choice is often the hard choice, sometimes the very hard choice. Still, if you compromise your values, it's never without consequences. So Psalm 15 reads as follows: Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to his neighbor, and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honors those who fear God, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, who lends money to the poor, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. Based on Psalm 15, this short prayer is a prayer for us to do the right thing. I hear you calling me, Lord. How can I respond to your invitation? Help me do what is right. You've given me a conscience so that I know what is right and wrong. Please give me the strength to follow it. You've given me words. Let them be words of truth. You've given me many blessings. Help me be generous with my gifts and use them for the common good. You've given me courage. Help me listen to my conscience and use my courage to do the right thing. Amen.
Al Zacher, born in Bay City, Michigan, has a bachelor degree from Antioch College, followed by almost 2 years in Korea during the war. He then received his master's degree in economics from the University of Michigan, settling in Fort Wayne in 1954, where he became an active industrial and commercial real estate person, forming a firm now headed by his son Steve, whom we have met. Through many years, he was a devoted member of a wide variety of not-for-profit organizations. He's been, for many years, a faithful member of Quest. He spent 8 years rehearsing and writing, researching and writing a book on the second term of U.S. presidents, and it's entitled Trial and Triumph, Presidential Power in the Second Term. This is a topic that he discovered had not been covered very much by historians. He asked Mayor Paul Helmke to send a copy of his book to his friend from Yale Law School, President Bill Clinton, who mentioned the book at his first press conference after his re-election. I think he was trying to get into your next book, Al. Al was then asked to appear on the Today Show for the inaugural, as well as on other national news broadcasts, including C-SPAN. He was also quoted in many national newspapers, and he thanks Tim Horton for his assisting in editing his paper for today's presentation. It's with great privilege and pleasure to introduce Al Zacher to us. Al?
I chose Truman because there was an awful lot of things happening during that time of interest. Secondly, there's an election that we were coming on an election, and that episode is possibly of interest. And then finally, Truman himself was sort of a unique person in the White House. "Give him hell, Harry," that encouraging shout from the voices of his supporters during Harry S. Truman's whistle-stop campaign says a great deal about the 33rd President of the United States, who spoke the language of the common man and inspired the broad support he needed to win his first elected term in 1948. Truman was a diligent student of the task set before him, honest to a fault, fiercely loyal to his party, to his friends, and to his allies. He was well-versed in history with a deep understanding of the American presidency and the objectives of the Founding Fathers. He was a man of courage, unshaken by criticism or adversity or crisis. To many, he appeared an average Midwesterner, a modest man who almost seemed to wear the presidency as a mantle of authority and honor as a means of carrying out his stewardship. He had self-confidence. He was a political realist who understood the electorate. Truman was raised in or near Independence, Missouri, in a matriarchal family steeped in Southern tradition. He was the son of a strong-willed, educated mother. His father was a farmer who lost heavily in grain, causing Harry to give up any thought of college. He joined his father to farm his maternal grandfather's 900 acres for 10 years of physically arduous work. World War I pulled Harry Truman from the farm into a field artillery unit in France, where he served as an officer with some distinction. He developed valued self-confidence from his success in courageously leading his men into dangerous combat. When the war ended, Captain Truman returned to Kansas City to join an old friend in the haberdashery business, but the severe economic recession that occurred after the war caused the bankruptcy of that fragile enterprise. Truman then decided to enter politics, a love he shared with his father, who had held modest political offices in the area. He successfully ran for county judge and administrative office with responsibility for such matters as building roads and bridges, receiving the endorsement of the Pendergrass family, power brokers in the Kansas City Democratic Party. He successfully ran for the office of presiding judge 2 years later and was reelected in recognition of his honest, diligent, frugal, and meticulous fulfillment of the post. In 1934, Harry Truman became the successful candidate for U.S. Senator from Missouri, riding into the office on the coattails of the widespread support for Roosevelt and the New Deal, but also because of his own grueling campaigning and the avid support of the Pendergast machine. He was a staunch New Dealer. He developed a close relationship with many of the inner circle in the upper house and was known as a hard and loyal worker for New Deal legislation, learning how well politics worked at the national level. Truman sought re-election in 1940, gaining the nomination with diligent campaigning and support from the railroad union and minorities, going on to win his re-election. The victory returned him to Washington as the war in Europe was heating up and American military preparedness was escalating. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor then led the United States to be an active participant, a most important participant in World War II. As Truman's new term began, he initiated an inspection tour of defense installations and production facilities, detecting significant waste and mismanagement. His speech to the Senate on the subject led to the formation of a watchdog committee of 5 senators to oversee defense contracts and the appointment of Truman as its chairman. Fortuitously for Truman and the nation, the committee's efforts resulted in billions of dollars in savings for the war effort and propelling the name of Harry S. Truman before the American public and before the Democratic Party. The exposure led to his nomination and selection as vice president in Roosevelt's 4th term in 1944. The Allied forces were moving toward a combat with Russian troops in Berlin, and American forces were in combat with the Japanese in Okinawa when Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945, just 3 short months after Truman's inauguration. Harry S. Truman suddenly became President of the United States without having been involved in or informed of the myriad of events and decisions he would face as Chief of State. He was catapulted into unexpectedly having to make decisions that would soon drive the war effort toward its conclusion in Europe, that might lead to the potentially cataclysmic invasion of the mainland of Japan, would perfect the atom bomb and test its effectiveness, and also would lead to the impending April 25th meeting in San Francisco to formulate and enact the United Nations. The Yalta Conference, the gathering of FDR, Churchill, and Stalin early in 1945, which was to have set a pattern for Soviet, British, and American cooperation for a free and independent Europe. It became unraveled just 4 months after the meeting as Russia asserted its own authority over governments in Poland, the Baltic, and the entire Eastern European sphere that it occupied. Congress had rebelled against Roosevelt as his administration settled in, angered by a lack of involvement with the decisions of Yalta. Truman, the grassroots political realist who had spent 10 years in the Senate and who was an exacting student of American history, set about to effectively rectify the impaired relationship with Congress. Although sympathy for the new president abounded, confidence in him was slow in coming, for he followed a master communicator whose voice was the stabilizing force of the entire free world. Truman spoke haltingly, in a monotone, appearing as a cautious, unsophisticated Midwesterner with down-home farm boy inflections, replacing the towering figure of Franklin Roosevelt. But the confidence of the nation was vested in its institutions and its impending success in the war. While the country grieved its loss, the new president honed his administration and leadership skills quickly, mustering his self-confidence to shoulder the responsibility thrust upon him. The responsibility for the nation during almost 8 more years would rest in the hands of a man whom the country barely knew, a man it certainly had not selected as its president. Truman, on the other hand, slipped rather quickly into harness. He studied every aspect of the challenges handed him. He gathered capable allies and advisors to help him understand Stalin and Churchill and the war and what the peace might bring. The Germans surrendered unconditionally on May 9th, followed in June by the successful completion of the United Nations Charter, which was approved by the Senate. In the same month, Truman attended a meeting in Potsdam, Germany, bringing him together with Stalin and Churchill. It was a frustrating endeavor which failed to settle the future of Germany or the liberation of Eastern Europe. Truman approved the testing of the atom bomb and gathered a blue ribbon committee to determine whether the bomb should be employed to end the war. The decision to drop the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was reached soon after the bomb was successfully tested, leading to a quick additional surrender of Japan on August 14th in 1945. The end of the war brought fears of the kind of severe recession which followed the demobilization after the First World War. This concern brought out the politician and New Dealer in Harry Truman within days after the war ended. He prepared an extraordinarily lengthy and encompassing program to provide jobs. Neither Congress nor the nation was ready for so much liberal legislation. Truman salvaged little more of his program than the GI Bill of Rights, which provided education for multi-millions of veterans. And also it provided the Council of Economic Advisors to assist the president in his overview of the economy. The nation had had enough of war and of government. The economy was functioning well as the war ended, and there was no interest in any more New Deal or Fair Deal, as Truman called his program. The public's unfulfilled wants and needs dating back to the 1930s became the principal concern of the world's only major nation not physically damaged by the war. Now comfortable in office, Truman began his tough, aggressive, and sometimes political confrontation with Congress and the voters, which became his trademark. Although his foreign policy would be given bipartisan support, getting tough with Congress on liberal policies did not work. Upheaval reigned as 1946 began. Rarely in American history has a president been faced with so many challenges while the country was at peace and free from depression. It was a strike-filled period with as many as 1 million workers walking off their jobs. Wartime controls were ending, and workers were hoping to improve their share of the economic pie. Appearing anti-union, the government sought to draft the railroad workers to prevent a strike. The coal mines were taken over and operated by the government. Shortly thereafter, Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, limiting the power of the unions, but Congress overrode the veto. The impatient nation did not respond well in the November elections, voting in the first Republican Congress since Herbert Hoover's days. And festering in the background was China, torn by civil strife resulting from the revolution of Mao's communists against the weak nation's government forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. The United States would shoulder only so much responsibility in an unstable world. The United States shipped food to England and Europe, now struggling to survive, and it enacted legislation which would sustain Greece and Turkey, beginning a long process of containing communism and protecting democratically elected states that would end with the lifting of the Iron Curtain some 40 years later. When America began to assert world authority under Harry Truman, it confronted the totalitarian Soviet Union and later China. World peace and democracy were imperiled. Although Congress was not inclined to follow the president in domestic matters, bipartisan foreign policy took root, with the containment of communism holding sway over any isolationist sentiment. It was equally conservative to oppose strong unionism in the expansion of the New Deal. But Truman remained undaunted, trying to maintain good relations with Congress while continuing to be an active and surprisingly innovative president who gathered about him men of skill, talent, and experience. The armed forces were unified, creating the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the situation in Great Britain, France, and Italy worsened as those countries failed to restore their economies or lead their citizens. Washington was concerned that a communist or tyrannical government might take over any of these nations. George C. Marshall, now Secretary of State and a spokesman for the administration, proposed a massive plan to aid and rehabilitate Europe in June of 1947. Congress resisted the outlandish proposal at first. Select committees were formed by Truman to define the need and describe how it be met with fiscal responsibility. Czechoslovakia fell to the communists in February of 1948. Congressmen traveled to Europe to discern for themselves how truly fragile were the democratic governments of Europe. By April 1948, Congress approved what became known as the Marshall Plan. As world crises ensued, national China was losing its battle with the communists, and in April 1948, the Soviets closed the roadway access to Berlin from Allied zones to the west, a near warlike act that might have brought on troop confrontations, but for the insightful resolution reached by the administration. Food and fuel were airlifted daily to Berlin by 130 planes. By June, the Senate passed a resolution approving the concept of a unified European defense with American participation, the first step toward what would become NATO. The year 1948 was filled with an array of foreign tensions that would easily rival those faced by any U.S. president, but it was also the election year, and as tensions and pressures upon American people expanded, so did inflation and the general discomfiture. Truman suffered a popularity rating of only 36%, according to a Gallup poll about the same time that the airlift to Berlin was begun. By 1948, the war was past. New conflicts confronted the nation abroad and at home. Labor continued to disrupt the domestic scene. America was administered by a president who, although respected, could not inspire enthusiasm for his style of leadership or for his creative stance on so many issues. While Truman easily won the Democratic nomination for president, it seemed a foregone conclusion that Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican nominee, would complete the Republican takeover of the executive as well as the legislative branch of government in November. The Democratic campaign was plagued with severe shortage of funds, barely meeting the cost of stamps for the mailing needed to solicit contributions. The left and right deserted the party as Henry Wallace, a strong advocate of appeasement to the Soviet Union, formed a party of his own, as did Senator Strom Thurmond, a Southern Democrat, who gathered about him all those who opposed Truman for his civil rights proposals. The press tended to like the president, who spoke frankly and frequently with them, always giving complete and knowledgeable replies or clearly stating no comment. His relationship with the 80th Congress was another matter, however. Despite the cooperation he received on foreign affairs, Truman used Congress and its reluctance to pass his liberal domestic policy as a whipping post in the election. He called them back into special session after the nominating conventions, demanding that they enact legislation to provide for national health insurance, an expansion of Social Security and rural electrification, and an increase in the minimum wage. Of course, Congress failed to respond to his demand. As the polls produced more certain evidence that the president would not be elected, Truman set out on a whistle-stop back of the train speech-making tour of the nation to communicate with his electorate. His relaxed self-confidence about winning the election set him apart from everyone in his administration and in his parties. He damned the do-nothing 80th Congress and spoke intimately and extemporaneously to each small and large group that gathered to hear him speak. The crowd readily joined in with the spirit of the plain-spoken candidate with such encouraging shouts as, "Give him hell, Harry." He traveled over 30,000 miles, giving an average of 10 speeches a day to upwards of 15 million people. It was a testament to his political savvy and also his remarkable endurance and strength, and to that of his wife and daughter who accompanied him on the tour. Despite the failure of all but one pollster to predict Truman victory, he won the election with Dewey receiving only 45% of the votes, sweeping in a Democratic Congress with him. The victory was attributed to the Truman campaign. Truman would now be president elected to office out of the shadow of FDR, his own man. Although the joy of victory was there for Truman, he understood history, and his leadership role was not endowed with self or ego. Truman was essentially an affable person, frequently smiling and genially cheerful in a folksy sort of way. He was customarily unflappable in the face of crisis, depending on the highly qualified men who filled positions of power around him to counsel him. In his inaugural address, he stressed his vision for a world order through his foreign policy, promoting support for the United Nations, the recovery of Europe through the Marshall Plan, military aid to the nations of the free world, and finally, assistance to the undeveloped nations through the transfer of knowledge in science and industry. Congress continued its bipartisan support of foreign policy, approving NATO. A military draft had been reinstituted the previous year. Europe apparently absorbed much of the attention the nation could muster as the nationalist Chinese acknowledged defeat in 1949 and retired to Taiwan. The United States had contributed more than $2 billion to that cause, but the administration finally concluded the result to save China from communism would be only by sending in American troops, which he would not do. The fall of China would have serious repercussions for Truman and the nation. It brought forth a group of China supporters whose vehemence over what they called a treasonable loss of a free nation opened a Pandora's box of investigation into communists in the Truman administration that wreaked havoc in the nation for the remaining term of the president. While the affairs of Europe and China festered, a political sectionalism overcame domestic America. Truman would not be given any leeway to expand on civil rights or social legislation with a Democratic legislature that was dominated by Southern and Western conservatives. But such domestic matters did not dominate his second term. Although the Berlin blockade ended, the power of the Soviet Union expanded as it exploded its own atomic bomb, encouraging Congress and the United Nations and the nation to back the president in initiatives to aid Europe. America became blanketed with the fear of the Soviet Union and communist expansion. The United States perfected the H-bomb to assure military superiority. Bipartisanship to stop communist expansion evolved, leading to competition between the president and Congress over the seat of greater anti-communist leadership and control. An organization known as the China First Lobby became the outspoken communist fighter attacking the administration for the loss of nationalist China. Yet military troop buildup at home was not a part of the equation for either the administration or Congress. The Marshall Plan was beginning to revive Europe. The line was being successfully drawn for Soviet expansion. Trade with Europe was fostering American economic growth. In the face of expanded foreign aid, the armed forces became the sacrificial lamb to the desire of a peacetime economy with a balanced budget. The military dropped from 12 million in 1945 to 1.5 million in 1947. It was one of several compromises that Truman would make early in his second term. He feared federal deficits, and he understood the limits existed to the responsibility which the United States might take and prioritize what was necessary. The turmoil of the 1940s and early 1950s were relatively uncharted seas for America in the world. The fall of China in 1949 set off a wave of anti-administration salvos that unnerved the public and the president. The most notorious player in a display of anti-communist investigations was the senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. Truman had initiated his own house cleaning of disloyal Americans early in his second administration. Defensiveness persuaded the administration, and nastiness pervaded those probing communism in government. American public, always impatient with failure, honed in on the loss of the nations of Eastern Europe and China to communism. The nation that had so gloriously won the war could not tolerate the anxiety of a Soviet power which had occupied and retained territory in that war where China lost. Public sentiment, some bad judgment, and the combined weight of world crises combined to sour the administration of Harry Truman when the war in Korea would dominate the world scene. In January 1950, Truman agreed to a defense aid agreement with Korea, which Congress refused to fund. Secretary of State Dean Acheson did not include Korea in the primary Asian defense perimeter of the United States in January. In June, the North Koreans invaded their southern neighbor, setting off a war that neither the administration nor the American people wanted. But the United States involvement seemed the logical step in meeting every communist force with force in the defense of non-communist frontiers. Truman's response was instantaneous. Whether the Soviet Union was party to the attack was unknown, but there was no time to find out as the North Koreans marched south, threatening the survival of not only one of that ally, but also Japan and the very presence of the United States in all of Asia. Truman and Acheson called on the Security Council of the United Nations to intervene militarily to halt the incursion. The Soviet Union had boycotted the UN over the failure to seat Communist China, allowing the United States to successfully petition that international body to defend South Korea. The move strengthened the UN by the leadership role thrust upon it as Americans and free world opinion supported the concept of the world body as a peacekeeper. South Korean forces were almost immediately overwhelmed by the army from the north. By the end of June, Truman supported General MacArthur's suggestion that American troops be deployed to save the Korean Peninsula. In September 1950, MacArthur maneuvered as brilliant as he had at any time in his career, invading the western shores of Korea near Seoul at Incheon, successfully driving a wedge into the heart of North Korean troops, winning back all of the territory that had been lost. Truman, following MacArthur's advice, ordered that the U.S. forces move north of the 38th parallel, which was the border between North and South Korea, but not cross the border into China with either troops or planes. In retrospect, that decision to move north of the 38th parallel incited the Chinese communists in late October as hordes of Chinese troops swarmed across the border. By late November, the UN forces were in disarray and full retreat. The midterm elections brought surprising strength to the Democrats, diffusing some of the criticism of Truman's handling of the war. But by December, the president was forced to declare a state of emergency. Wage and price controls were instituted, fearing inflation. Taxes were raised. The National Guard was called up, and the draft was extended. The Army expanded. The failure of the nation to prepare itself for military conflagration was being turned around. The failure to declare war, however, dampened public allegiance to a police action that dragged on for the remaining 2 years of the Truman administration. By January 1951, the UN began peace negotiations with the Chinese. Douglas MacArthur, however, pursued an independent course and demanded that the UN carry the war north to the Yalu River into China against the express orders of Truman, who was diligently attempting to reach a compromise truce with the Chinese that would allow them to save face. MacArthur's attack on the Chinese and a demand for the total defeat led to Truman's decision to fire the popular general. It was a courageous and decisive move by the president, but hardly one that would enhance his popularity with either the general public, now tired of the war. An armistice was signed in July 1953, ending the conflict, establishing the 38th parallel as the boundary of the two nations. Although the Korean War was one that could be made at the 38th parallel, it was not without damage to the popularity of the president. The 1952 election pitted General Dwight D. Eisenhower against Governor Adlai Stevenson, Illinois, who would not permit his name to be associated with Harry Truman and his nomination for the campaign. The Republican Eisenhower victory was attributed to the adulation with which he was held by the American public, but it was also an expression of dissatisfaction with Harry Truman. Presidents who lean against the wind and propose a course which is not already firmly entrenched in the American psyche may endure unpopularity. It is a courageous president who will lead and spend his political popularity in causes he believes to be in the best interest of the nation and the free world. Truman was not gifted with urbane rhetoric. His leadership had to rest with his ideas and his acts. He undoubtedly benefited from the clear-cut lessons of World War I and World War II that the aggressor is best stopped early. Truman and the high-quality personnel he gathered around him produced innovative solutions in a wide array of both domestic and foreign crises. He developed the containment policy, which would be followed for 40 years, eventually bringing the communist world into the Council of Nations. He was, however, a man who gave no joy to the country in his leadership. He contrasted totally with FDR and his style. Truman was so plain and so unceremonial, yet reasonable and appropriate, that the ingestion of policies was taken by the American people almost as a dose of castor oil. He would initiate a dramatic new policy and implement it with diligence and intelligence and dispatch, yet he could be intemperate with Americans found distasteful. Truman's first term was exemplary for its innovative, risk-taking forays into uncharted leadership. He had vision of world peace and domestic achievement, which he communicated adequately to both Congress and the nation. His second term, however, focused on only what he and the nation believed to be the defense of an anti-communist and democratic way of life. Although it limited the scope of its term, it clearly followed the vision he had set for the nation and the world. In retrospect, popularity and style do not function well as a measure of a president. These may represent pandering to public sentiment, following the polls, playing it safe, postponing solutions, avoiding confrontation and conflict. Truman did none of that. He was willing to compromise, but he was also contentious occasionally. But he led America and the anti-communist world through 7 years, leading the nation and the world far stronger and safer and enduring. Thank you.